My name is Keith McArthur, and I'm the father of a teenager with high special needs. He's got physical and cognitive disabilities, and his name is Bryson.
Can you talk about your podcast, Unlocking Bryson's Brain?
Sure, yeah. So about 2 years ago, I learned from scientists that they thought that the part of the brain that Bryson's rare disease targets, the GRIN1 receptor or the GRIN1 gene and the NMDA receptor, was a part of the brain that was responsive to therapies, could potentially be responsive to gene therapies. And there was also research that showed that this one researcher built a mouse with an on-off switch where she realized that you could kind of use CRISPR, use gene editing to create a mouse with a variant in the GRIN1 gene, so a similar mutation to what our kids have. And then when the mouse grew up to become an adult, she could turn off this on-off switch. And then when she did that, not only did the mouse's genes go back to normal, but its phenotype, all of its symptoms went not completely back to wild type, but it seemed to be more like a typical mouse. And so these messages just gave me so much hope that I decided that, I wanted to kind of devote my life to looking into these cures and therapies that could help Bryson and other people like him to be able to communicate better, express his wants and needs. And at the same time, because of my background as a journalist, I brought my recorder with me as I started having these meetings with researchers, and just thought that it could make a great podcast. And so I went to the CBC and they agreed. And so Unlocking Bryson's Brain is an 8-part podcast series about Bryson and his rare disease and our family's search for a cure.
Can you tell me about Bryson? What is his personality like?
Yeah, Bryson is, really happy and social most of the time. He really likes being around people. He likes being around his brother Connor and Laura and I and his caregiver Edna. He also has these episodes that we've kind of always wondered if they're a kind of seizure or if there's something different. They'll kind of come up out of nowhere, and he's really upset and seems like he's angry and starts hurting himself and others. So so most of the time he's so happy, but he also has these moments that seem really hard for him and, also become hard for anyone around him.
So you talk about how you're searching for this cure, but it's kind of uncertain right now when exactly that cure would become available down the road. How do you balance this idea of really searching for a cure and trying to get to the bottom of it, but also just practicing acceptance as well of his condition?
Yeah, that's something that I certainly, wrestle with personally, and also wrestle with in the podcast. In terms of accepting Bryson and his condition, we love him as he is. He's perfect to us. And so we want to do everything that we can to make the world an easier place for him. And so much of that is changing his external environment, and that's so much of what we need to do just generally with any kind of disability is to work to advocate to change the external environment. But because Bryson has these cognitive difficulties and has trouble expressing himself, we really worry about the future and what will happen to him when we're not around to take care of him. There is a lot of abuse that does happen to kids or even adults that have, are nonverbal or at least not able to communicate at all and have developmental difficulties. So these are some of the things that we're really scared of. So it is this balance of, wanting to cherish him and we cherish him the way he is now, but also wanting to do whatever we can to try to help him to have an easier life.
What were you hoping to achieve with your podcast?
A few different things. So one is, Bryson's 13. So we've been living with his challenges for a long time. And there's this thing that happens when, you first learn that your child has a disability. there's this period of mourning where you kind of expected this typical child, and you realize that the child that you thought you were going to get is very different from the one that you got. And, over time, we can come to a place where we can accept that he's better, that we're so grateful that he's our son. But so many people, when they're first getting these diagnoses, they're going through this period of mourning. They're going through a lot of pain. And so much of us getting a diagnosis and connecting with other families was kind of helping to normalize that experience for all these other families. And I feel like the podcast, one of my goals really is to help with that too, not just for people living with GRIN disorder, which is Bryson's condition, but kind of any kind of rare disease, and helping to provide maybe families with a new diagnosis to feel more of a sense of community. But at the same time, one of my goals is also just to see if there's anybody out there that might have clues that could, help us to figure out what to do next. What are the other avenues we should pursue in trying to find cures or therapies for Bryson that could, help him to maybe not learn to walk, but learn to push his own wheelchair, maybe not learn to talk, but communicate through assistive devices. So, I've been really grateful that I have heard from a lot of people that have come forward with, different suggestions, for example, on assisted communication and things that they would recommend that we try with Bryson. So that's been great.
So have you connected with many, you were talking about creating this sense of community through your podcast with other families that are living with rare diseases. Mm-hmm. And myself, I live with a chronic illness myself, and so much of your family story I can relate to, that uncertainty. Right. And being undiagnosed for a little while, and just the period of that uncertainty. Have you heard from many families who have someone in their household with a rare disease, just reaching out to you, expressing thanks for the sense of social support?
Yeah, we have. I've seen, there's been people that have reached out to me directly. I've also just seen, other people on social media that are sharing about the podcast, people that I don't know that are other places that are talking about how close it hits to home to their own experience. And the other thing that I've been really grateful about too is, for example, hearing from someone who grew up with a brother with severe special needs, and her brother died, but now she's an adult, and she really kind of felt this connection for what my son Connor was saying and how he relates to Bryson. So, and another person who has, for example, who has a physical disability and could sort of see in what I'm talking about, what she's seen her own mom kind of do with her and for her through her years. And so, those connections with, families, not only families of people with disabilities, but also people living with disabilities themselves, has been really gratifying.
Yeah, you mentioned Connor there, and I mean, something that jumps out, and I'm not the first person to comment on this, but how Connor just seems wise way beyond his years. Do you think like Bryson's developmental disorder has really shaped him in that regard?
Yeah, I think it probably has. And the other thing that's been really fun to see is just, even during the year that I was working on the podcast, is to see the growth in Connor. So, there were some things that he sort of talked about when I first interviewed him a year ago, that by the time we kind of did our final interviews, our final chats for the podcast, his thinking had evolved. He was very, I think what resonates with people a lot is how kind of, candid and honest he is, and how good he is at kind of expressing his own feelings. And so he has some kind of tough things to say, especially early on, where he talks about how, it almost feels, I think at one point he says, it almost feels like Bryson is just there. Like, I don't really know my brother. Like, I love him, but I don't really know him. And then in the final episode, we have this conversation where his thinking has really evolved around it. And he says, yeah, now Bryson, I feel like he's this person that I know, and that I do feel like there are things that I can do to help him. And now I do really see how he lights up when I'm around. And so that's, really, really gratifying to see.
Right. Doing the podcast, it makes you more aware of those things, like looking inward and reflecting,
Yeah,
and all that.
it's kind of forced us to have some conversations, Laura and I with each other, my wife Laura and I with each other, but also with my son Connor, that maybe we wouldn't have had otherwise.
So one of the things that you talk about in your show is your connection with all those other GRIN families and the sense of community and social support that you have for one another. Could you talk about, like, what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Um, so it's something that really right from the start made such a big difference for us. It took us 10 years to get Bryson's diagnosis. So he went through all kinds of tests while we were trying to figure out what was causing him to be the way that he was. And, when we first got the diagnosis, we were on the way home. I was driving and Laura was like already Googling about GRIN1. And so finding some scientific papers, but over the next couple of days, we kept searching, and we also found the first families, and we discovered this group on Facebook where there were 7 other families where kids had been diagnosed with GRIN1. And so that really was huge for us to be able to connect with these other families. And it really felt like they were like a literal family to us, like these people that it almost felt like they'd always been part of our lives, but we just didn't know. And, to be able to talk to them really candidly about the fact that we can both mourn for the children that we didn't get and be sad about that, and be worried about our kids, but also cherish these wonderful humans that we were given and that are living with us. So yeah, it really has meant a lot. That community has been very important, and I would say that we were sort of plugged into the kind of generic rare disease community before we got the diagnosis, but it really wasn't the same, right? We knew there were lots of other people who either had diagnoses or didn't, but really understanding that there's these other families where the kids have the exact same condition as our son, changed, I would say literally changed our lives in the way that we think about ourselves. It suddenly felt like Bryson wasn't alone, and that meant so much.
Do you have any advice for anyone or any individual family that is currently undiagnosed? Like for any individual who has an undiagnosed condition or disease?
Yeah, I think the advice would just be to, now this isn't going to apply for everything, but if doctors think that it's a genetic condition, we just spent so much time going through these one-off tests, but it wasn't until we got the whole exome sequencing that we were able to really get the diagnosis. So I would just encourage parents to be pushy to get that test, because we're in this place where in Canada, I think most governments aren't covering the whole exome sequencing as a general rule. So you have to, get on a waiting list and get special permission. Where interestingly, in the US, a lot of the insurance companies are further along in approving it, because they've done the cost benefit analysis, and they actually see that doing 20 different individual tests is going to be a lot more expensive than doing this one whole exome sequencing test. And so it seems like in the US, at least for patients who are fortunate enough to have health coverage, because I recognize that everybody in the US doesn't, but for those that do, they seem to be getting the testing earlier and getting earlier diagnoses than families in Canada. We know, you would think we should know in theory, just because of the population sizes. We probably know 300 people in the US with GRIN disorder, so we should know 30 in Canada, but I think the actual number is maybe 4 or 5 that we know. So definitely we're behind in the diagnosis here.
Do they have any idea of how many cases of GRIN disorder there are worldwide?
Yeah, so there's a paper that was just published recently, actually, that if you extrapolate out the numbers, because I think it's something like 20 out of 100,000 births is what this paper estimates, based on the 4 GRIN genes that are pathogenic: GRIN1, GRIN2A, GRIN2B, and GRIN2D. I might have that number wrong, but I think it's about 20. But if you extrapolate it out, even if you assume that people with GRIN disorder have a shorter lifespan, because typically people with physical and developmental disabilities do, you would still see probably between 1 million and 2 million people in the world living with GRIN disorder, and the number that we think have been diagnosed is probably only around 1,000. So the
Wow.
vast majority of people that have this disease have not been diagnosed.
And so, yeah, these are people who are going to live their entire lives without having a diagnosis.
That's right.
I couldn't imagine what that experience would even be like. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, there's going to be, here's the other interesting thing is that again, I've said this already, but we don't think this is a degenerative disease. So we think that people with GRIN will live, something close to a normal lifespan. But we don't know anybody at all with the disease who's older than 30. And so, there's all these people who are living with it that may be in group homes, maybe are living with their parents, but are just at the point where, maybe 10 years ago, their doctors have said, we've done everything we can. We're never going to find a diagnosis. And so since then, the cost of whole exome sequencing has really come down. It's much more affordable, but these patients or their family advocates just aren't, pushing for a diagnosis anymore. So they may never get one.
Do you feel that prejudice or privilege has played any sort of role in your family's experience in navigating the medical system?
I definitely do. I mean, I think the fact that, I think there's so many different factors related to equity and care. Obviously, race and poverty and education. But I actually think one of the biggest ones is probably, language, that people who don't speak English really well, they are going to have a really hard time being pushy and advocating in a way that Laura and I are able to. So certainly we recognize that we've had this privilege in the healthcare system because we, have both have university degrees. Laura works in healthcare. We speak English. We have money. That definitely has given us this privilege to be pushy parents in a way that some others can't. So we definitely, are I guess need to recognize that.
So something that you talk about in your podcast quite a bit is the ethics behind searching for a cure or curing a developmental disorder like Bryson's. Could you talk a little bit about the ethics behind that and your decision to include that in your podcast series?
Yeah, this was actually, I would say, as I was researching the podcast, this is the area that really got me thinking the most. That because I think I hadn't even really thought of the idea that cure could be controversial in any way. Like, I think my own there's definitely like an ableist bias that I brought to it, and I hadn't recognized the other side at all. So it was great to be able to have some conversations as part of the podcast with people living with disabilities and to get this other perspective, because the idea is that, for doctors, scientists, parents of kids with rare diseases, typically we think of cure as just an unquestioned good, that we want to do what we can to help our kids. And if we can cure what's wrong with them, then why wouldn't we want to? But the flip side that I discovered when I started, talking to people is this idea that for a lot of people who are living with disabilities, they wouldn't necessarily want to change them. So someone who is blind, everyone, people around them tend to assume, of course, they should want to see. But there's a lot of people who are blind who will say, no, this is me. I've learned to live this way. And I want attention focused on, how do we change the world so that someone who is blind doesn't have all these barriers in the way. Someone who's got, I spoke with someone in the podcast who has a form of dwarfism, and it led to disabilities. And he kind of said the same thing, that people assume that he should want to be taller or, want to be able to walk normally, but that's part of who he is. And so, so that was really interesting to me, kind of learning this, and really forced me to think a lot about what I mean when I talk about a cure for Bryson, and why it's important. And I think, to be honest, even after all that, I still think that if there were a pill that we could give Bryson that would make him neurotypical, that I think that I probably would still want that for him, because I think that his life is so hard, and there are all of these ways that being able to communicate would help him. But at the same time, I think having these conversations has also led to kind of a form of acceptance, that I realize that it's probably not likely that Bryson will ever get a cure that makes him fully neurotypical because of the way that he's already developed. As you talked about earlier, his brain's already developed, because of the fact that there's certain skills that we think that there are, critical periods for learning. So like the part of language that involves grammar and syntax and be able to speak in complete sentences. A lot of researchers think that that's not really possible after you're maybe 12 years old, kind of thing. So there may never be a full cure, but I've really thought about all of these other things that could make Bryson's life easier. And it just really makes me, thinking about all this just makes me really challenge myself and make sure everything that I'm thinking about, that it really is in Bryson's best interest, and that it is what Bryson would want. And, as much as he is able to communicate, to be able to kind of pick up on his cues, and, even to tell him and ask him what we're doing, even if I don't know if he can understand, or if I can't understand what he says back.
Right. So you've spent all this time chatting, networking with different scientists, talking with them about potential cures down the line. What do you think, or is there? Do you have an idea of what is the most likely outcome for Bryson in the future?
I think there's going to be two different routes. So I think that over the short term, we're going to see more like drugs, like what we think of typically as medicine, like a small molecule drug that he could, either take as a pill, or it could be an injection that just helps to modify the way that his brain works. So we've learned that these NMDA receptors in his brain that are part of the brain neurons, that they are underactive. So they're only performing at about half of typical level. So if there were, I think that in the near term, meaning maybe 5 to 10 years, I think we'll likely see some pill or something that Bryson could take that would help, get that maybe from 50% up to 60 or 70%. So it might enable him to learn more, to communicate more, to make bigger strides. I think that over the long term, and this may be, more like 20 to 30 years, I think that we're going to see gene editing or other kinds of gene therapies being able to be delivered to the brain that could actually change his DNA. So things like CRISPR and other kinds of gene editing that allow us to actually rewrite DNA. I think we're going to see that. And I think that probably in new infants that are first diagnosed with GRIN disorder, that it might actually restore them to something really much closer to a typical life. I think with Bryson, because that's going to happen when he's fully an adult, I think that it may improve a lot of his symptoms and may make it easier for him to speak, or to use an assistive device, or use sign language to communicate. I think that it may help him to be able to, move his own wheelchair instead of us having to push him. So I think that there will definitely be things that will give him a lot more agency in his own life. But I'm no longer so sure as maybe I was when I first started looking into this, that, something's going to happen that will someday make him fully neurotypical.
Right. And speaking more broadly on gene editing for all rare diseases, do they expect, do scientists expect in the future to be able to cure all rare diseases?
Yeah, so it would work specifically just in genetic diseases. And so that's not, I guess, not all of them. The easiest ones are the ones where they know that it's just a single gene that causes it, right? So GRIN disorder is something where they know exactly what the gene is. And so they could potentially, like they can do it now in a Petri dish. They could do it now in a mouse. They could go and correct the gene and see what happens. spinal, sorry, sickle cell anemia is one disease where they're already doing trials for CRISPR. So basically, it's a blood disease. It's really easy to administer, like basically to take cells out of your body, change them in a petri dish, and then put them back into your body, and your cardiovascular system just circulates them, automatically. It's a lot harder to deliver to the brain. So these diseases, like of the liver, of the eyes, of the blood, those are the ones where kind of the science is the most advanced. And I think that, so if it's in one of those three areas and it just involves a single gene, I think it's going to happen pretty soon because there's clinical trials already underway. I think if it's in a harder to target area like the brain, or if it's a disease like autism or Alzheimer's that, we know is genetic, but we also know involves a bunch of different genes, and those genes vary from person to person. I think with those, it's going to be some time longer because they're going to actually need to understand how many different genes they need to correct.
So what is one thing that Bryson's disorder has taken from you, and what is one thing that it has given you?
That's a tough one because, certainly for the first few years, when you talk about taken, like there was definitely a period of time where I really felt sorry for myself and felt like this perfect family that we were supposed to have had been taken from me. I don't feel like that anymore, and I haven't in a while. So I honestly don't know if I would say today that I really feel like anything's been taken from me. I guess really it's I guess thinking about it more, I would say that it's kind of just no one can ever be certain about the future. I think that I probably, Laura and I probably have much more uncertainty than most people would have. It's harder for us to think about planning for our retirement or, where we might live in the future. So I would say that's the one thing that maybe has been taken from us. On the other hand, I feel like there's so much that I've learned from Bryson. Like I wouldn't wish what he's going through on anyone. And I don't want to, say that I'm benefiting from the hard things that he's going through. But at the same time, I have learned a lot from him. I have learned, I think it's maybe giving me more empathy as a human. I think that it's probably made me a better father to my other son, and a better husband to my wife. So I think there are a lot of ways that he's made my life better.
I'm in quarantine from COVID-19, at home staying clean, waiting on a vaccine, self-isolation, physical distance. If you don't, you threaten our existence. Here's a list of those at high risk, dying by the virus. All we got: heart disease, lung disease, hypertension, diabetes, give me your attention. Cerebral palsy, cancer, follow me, follow. There's only one answer: lay low, time to preserve. Stay home, flatten the curve. If you're asymptomatic, that's still problematic. Incubation, that's 14 days, son. Stay in your place, unless it's essential. 6 feet of space, where death is the potential. Whatever the weather, we're in this together. Lay low, yo, and stay the home.